The morning sun cast long shadows across the rust-colored earth of Amboseli National Park, where the acacia trees stood like ancient sentinels against the endless African sky. But on this particular dawn, the usual symphony of awakening wildlife was broken by the sound of helicopter blades cutting through the crisp air. Below, a tragedy had unfolded in the night that would forever change the life of one tiny elephant. Django weighed barely 45 pounds when the rescue team found him. 3 weeks old, with skin still wrinkled from his recent arrival into the world, he stood motionless beside his mother's still form. The magnificent matriarch, who had led her family through countless dry seasons and migrations, had finally succumbed to the drought that had been ravaging the ecosystem for months. Her massive body, once a symbol of strength and wisdom, now lay silent in the red dust. The David Sheldrick Wildlife Trust team worked with practiced efficiency, but their hearts ached as they approached the trembling calf. Django's eyes, still cloudy with the confusion of youth, darted between the approaching humans and his mother's motionless trunk. His own tiny trunk, no bigger than a garden hose, quivered as he tried to understand why she wouldn't respond to his desperate calls. Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead veterinarian, knelt in the dirt as she examined the calf. His breathing was shallow and rapid, his small frame dehydrated from exposure to the scorching sun. Most critically, his body temperature had dropped dangerously low during the cold desert night. Elephant calves are entirely dependent on their mothers for the first years of life. Not just for milk, but for the warmth and comfort that only comes from sleeping pressed against a massive, loving body. The helicopter ride to the Nairobi nursery was Django's first separation from the red earth that had been his entire world. Wrapped in emergency blankets, he trembled not just from cold, but from a profound terror that no 3-week-old creature should ever experience. The rescue team took turns holding him, trying to provide the comfort his mother's trunk would have given, but his cries echoed over the engine noise, raw and heartbreaking. At the nursery, a specialized intensive care room waited. Heat lamps bathed the space in a warm, golden glow, and the walls were painted in soothing earth tones. This was where the sanctuary's most fragile rescues began their journey back to life. The room was equipped with everything modern veterinary science could provide, from IV drips for rapid rehydration to specialized milk formulas developed specifically for orphaned elephants. But despite the warmth and medical attention, Django remained inconsolable. He refused to eat, turning his head away from bottles of carefully prepared elephant milk replacer. His body shook continuously, not from cold now, but from grief and terror. The sanctuary staff had seen this before. Young elephants, more than perhaps any other species, form profound emotional bonds. The loss of a mother doesn't just mean the loss of food and protection. It's the shattering of their entire emotional world. For 3 days, Django barely slept. When exhaustion finally overtook him, his rest was fitful and brief. He would wake with small, panicked trumpets, searching for the familiar smell and touch of his mother. The veterinary team worked around the clock, providing nutrition through feeding tubes when necessary. But they all knew that medical intervention could only do so much. What Django needed was something that couldn't be prescribed or administered through a needle. It was Mary Owusu, a keeper who had worked with orphaned elephants for over 15 years, who first suggested they try something unconventional. The nursery's small office adjacent to the medical room contained a worn but comfortable brown leather sofa where staff often caught quick naps between feeding schedules. The couch was old, its cushions soft and yielding from years of use, and it held the accumulated warmth and scent of the many people who had cared for elephants before. On Django's 4th night at the sanctuary, as he lay trembling on the sterile medical mattress despite the heat lamps, Mary gently lifted his small form and carried him to the office. She had an intuition born from years of reading elephant behavior, a sense that sometimes the most advanced medical equipment couldn't replace the simple comfort of softness and human presence. As she settled Django onto the sofa's cushions, something remarkable happened. The trembling that had racked his small body for days began to subside. His head, which had been held rigidly upright in constant alert, slowly lowered until his cheek rested against the warm leather. For the first time since the rescue, his muscles relaxed completely. Mary watched in amazement as Django's breathing deepened and steadied. His tiny trunk, which had been curled tightly against his body in distress, gradually unfurled and began to explore the texture of the couch. The soft leather seemed to remind him of something primal and comforting, perhaps triggering cellular memories of pressing against his mother's warm, textured skin. That night, for the first time in nearly a week, Django slept deeply. Mary dozed fitfully in the chair beside the sofa, waking every few minutes to check on him, but the little elephant remained peaceful. As dawn approached, she felt a gentle touch on her hand. Django's trunk tip was brushing against her fingers, a tentative exploration that elephants use to gather information about their world. It was the first sign of curiosity he had shown since arriving. When the morning shift arrived, they found an extraordinary scene. Django was not just sleeping. He was sprawled across the sofa cushions with the complete abandon of a creature who felt safe. His legs were akimbo, his trunk draped over the armrest, and his breathing was so deep and peaceful that Dr. Chen had to look closely to ensure he was still alive. More importantly, when they offered him his morning bottle, he accepted it eagerly for the first time. Word spread quickly through the sanctuary. Django had found his sanctuary within the sanctuary. But what none of them realized yet was that this old leather sofa would become the cornerstone of his healing, the foundation upon which his trust in the world would slowly be rebuilt. The transformation was as swift as it was remarkable. Within a week of his first night on the sofa, Django had gained 7 pounds. His ribs, which had been starkly visible beneath his gray skin, began to disappear under a layer of healthy fat. His eyes, once dull with trauma and exhaustion, started to show sparks of the intelligence and curiosity that define his species. But perhaps most tellingly, Django refused to sleep anywhere else. Every evening, as the sun painted the Kenyan sky in brilliant oranges and purples, he would make his way unsteadily to the office and position himself expectantly beside the sofa. If a keeper tried to guide him back to the medical room with its specially designed elephant bedding, he would trumpet his displeasure, a sound that started as barely a squeak but grew stronger each day. Dr. Chen initially worried about this behavior. Elephants in the wild sleep on the ground, often standing up, and she feared that allowing Django to become dependent on human furniture might complicate his eventual return to the wild. But as she observed him more closely, she began to understand that this wasn't simple comfort-seeking. It was something much deeper. Elephants are among the most emotionally complex animals on Earth. They mourn their dead, celebrate births, and form bonds that last lifetimes. For a calf as young as Django, the mother's body provides more than just physical comfort. It's the entire universe of safety and love. The sofa, with its soft surfaces and accumulated human warmth, was serving as a surrogate for that lost maternal presence. The daily routine that developed around Django's sofa time became a carefully orchestrated dance of care. Each evening, keeper Susan Wangi would lift him onto the cushions, a task that became more challenging as he grew stronger and heavier. At 3 weeks old, he had been light enough for one person to manage. By 6 weeks, it required 2 keepers, and they began to worry about what would happen when he outgrew their ability to lift him entirely. But those concerns faded into the background when they witnessed the profound peace that settled over Django each night. His sleeping position became a beloved ritual, watched by staff who would peek into the office to check on him. He would start by standing on the sofa, testing its stability with his large feet. Then, with the deliberate movements of someone performing a sacred ceremony, he would slowly lower himself until his belly rested on the cushions. His head would settle against the armrest, often with his trunk draped over the side like a boneless appendage. His back legs would stretch out behind him, and his front legs would tuck slightly under his chest. In this position, he looked less like a wild African elephant and more like an enormous house cat who had claimed the best spot in the house. The similarity was so striking that the keepers began referring to these sessions as Django's catnaps, despite the fact that each one lasted for hours. The sofa became more than just a sleeping place. It was Django's emotional anchor. During the day, when he was learning to interact with other rescued elephants or receiving his medical checkups, he would periodically return to the office just to touch the couch with his trunk. It was as if he needed to reassure himself that his safe space was still there, waiting for him. The sanctuary's behavioral specialist, Dr. James Kiprotich, documented these interactions with fascination. Django had developed a complex relationship with different parts of the sofa. He preferred the left cushion for sleeping, but used the right side for what Dr. Kiprotich termed processing behavior. When Django encountered something new or stressful during the day, he would later be found sitting upright on the right cushion, his trunk moving rhythmically as he worked through whatever had troubled him. Most remarkably, Django began to communicate differently when he was on the sofa. Elephants have an extensive vocabulary of rumbles, trumpets, and squeaks, many of which are below human hearing range. On the couch, Django developed what the keepers called his sofa sounds, soft contentment rumbles that were entirely different from his distress calls or excitement trumpets. These sounds were so peaceful that several keepers reported they helped them sleep during their night shifts when they dozed in chairs nearby. As weeks passed, the little elephant's relationship with the sofa evolved. He learned to climb onto it himself, first by backing up against it and pushing himself up with his hind legs, then later with a more coordinated frontal approach that involved placing his front feet on the cushions and heaving his body upward. The first time he accomplished this feat independently, the entire day shift gathered to watch and cheer, their excitement almost matching Django's obvious pride in his accomplishment. The sofa also became a bridge between Django and his human caregivers. Elephants are remarkably intelligent and perceptive animals, capable of recognizing individual humans and forming preferences and relationships. From his position on the couch, Django began to interact more confidently with the keepers. He would reach out with his trunk to touch their faces, learning to distinguish between Mary's gentle hands, Susan's soothing voice, and Dr. Chen's precise clinical examinations. It was during one of these couch interactions that Django first displayed what the elephant research community calls trunk handshakes. When keeper David Mwakali knelt beside the sofa one evening, Django extended his trunk and wrapped it gently around David's wrist. The gesture lasted only a few seconds, but it was a profound moment of trust and connection. From that night forward, Django would shake hands with each keeper before settling down to sleep. The sofa became a place where Django learned that human touch could be comforting rather than frightening. The keepers would sit beside him, gently scratching behind his ears or stroking his trunk, teaching him that he was safe and loved. These sessions became so important that they were built into his official care schedule, labeled as comfort therapy in his medical records. But perhaps the most touching development was Django's protective behavior toward the sofa itself. When new keepers or veterinarians approached while he was resting, he would position himself between them and his beloved couch, not aggressively, but with clear intent. He had claimed this space as his own, and he was prepared to defend it if necessary. As autumn approached and Django grew stronger and more confident, the sanctuary staff began to face a bittersweet reality. Their healing was working perhaps too well. The tiny, traumatized calf who had arrived months ago was becoming a robust, curious young elephant. But with that growth came the inevitable question: what would happen when he became too large for the sofa that had saved his life? The question answered itself on a crisp morning in early October. Django, now 3 months old and weighing nearly 180 pounds, approached his beloved sofa with his usual evening enthusiasm. But as he attempted his practiced climb onto the cushions, the sound of straining leather filled the office. The couch, which had faithfully supported him through his recovery, was finally reaching its structural limits. Dr. Chen watched anxiously as Django settled into position, the sofa frame creaking ominously beneath his weight. The little elephant seemed oblivious to the concern of the humans around him, but the keepers exchanged worried glances. They had known this day would come, but facing it proved more emotionally challenging than anyone had anticipated. The practical problems were obvious. If the sofa collapsed while Django was sleeping, he could be injured. More importantly, as he continued to grow, his dependence on this specific piece of furniture could become a serious obstacle to his eventual reintroduction to a herd of wild elephants. No elephant in Amboseli National Park would have access to a leather sofa, and the sanctuary's ultimate goal was always to return their charges to the wild. But the emotional considerations were equally complex. The sofa represented more than just comfort for Django. It was the cornerstone of his recovery, the place where he had learned to trust again. Taking it away abruptly could trigger the same trauma responses that had nearly killed him during his first days at the sanctuary. Dr. Kiprotich, the behavioral specialist, proposed a gradual transition plan. Rather than removing the sofa, they would slowly introduce Django to alternative sleeping arrangements that could bridge the gap between his current dependence and the natural sleeping behaviors he would need in the wild. The process would need to be so gradual that Django would barely notice the changes. The first step was the introduction of natural materials around and on the sofa. Keeper Mary began bringing in soft grasses from the sanctuary grounds, the same types that elephants use to create comfortable sleeping spots in the wild. She scattered these around the office and eventually began placing small bundles on the sofa itself. Django's reaction was immediate and positive. His trunk explored the grasses with intense curiosity, and he began incorporating them into his evening routine. Instead of simply lying on the leather cushions, he would first arrange the grasses to his satisfaction, creating what appeared to be a primitive but deliberate nest. Encouraged by this response, the team gradually increased the amount of natural material. Soft hay was added, then dried leaves from elephant-favored trees, and finally small branches that Django could manipulate with his trunk. Within 2 weeks, the sofa was almost entirely covered with natural bedding materials that Django had arranged himself. The transformation was remarkable to observe. Django's evening ritual, which had once consisted of simply climbing onto the couch and collapsing in exhaustion, evolved into an elaborate process of nest building that could last for 30 minutes. He would methodically arrange and rearrange the materials, testing different configurations until he found one that satisfied his particular requirements. Dr. Chen documented each stage of this evolution, recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Django was teaching himself behaviors that his mother would normally have shown him. Through his own experimentation and instinct, he was rediscovering the ancient elephant knowledge of creating comfortable sleeping spaces from natural materials. The next phase involved gradually lowering the elevation of his sleeping space. The sanctuary's maintenance team, working under Dr. Kiprotich's guidance, began the delicate task of creating a step-down system. They built a series of platforms, each slightly lower than the sofa, that could be introduced over time. The first platform was only 2 inches lower than the sofa cushions and was positioned right next to it. Django, now comfortable with his grass-gathering behavior, seemed to barely notice the change when his bedding materials extended onto this new surface. Within a few days, he was sleeping partially on the original sofa and partially on the platform. Week by week, additional platforms were added, each one incrementally lower than the last. Django's sleeping space gradually expanded as he began to use multiple levels, arranging his grasses and leaves across the entire area. The process was so gradual that he adapted to each change without distress. The most crucial test came when the sanctuary team introduced what they called the ground platform, essentially a raised bed of earth that was built up to match the height of the lowest artificial platform. This would be Django's bridge to sleeping on natural ground, the way elephants had done for millions of years. The introduction of actual earth into his sleeping space triggered something profound in Django's developing awareness. He spent hours exploring the new surface with his trunk, digging small holes and then filling them in again. His trunk, which had grown longer and more dexterous over the months, began to display the complex manipulation behaviors that elephants use to create comfortable sleeping depressions in the wild. One evening, as the keepers watched from the doorway, Django did something that brought tears to Mary's eyes. Instead of climbing onto the sofa at all, He went directly to the earth platform. Using his trunk and feet, he excavated a shallow depression exactly the size of his body. He then carefully lined this depression with the softest grasses and leaves he could find. Finally, he lowered himself into this self-made bed and settled in for the night. For the first time since his arrival at the sanctuary, Django was sleeping on the earth, just as his ancestors had done for countless generations. But he had arrived at this natural behavior through his own discovery process, building confidence and skills that would serve him well in the wild. The original sofa, now largely unused, remained in the corner of the office like a faithful friend who had completed an important mission. Django would still occasionally approach it during the day, touching it with his trunk in what seemed like a gesture of acknowledgement. But his nighttime allegiance had shifted to the earthbed he created fresh each evening. Dr. Chen documented this transition as one of the most successful rehabilitation progressions she had witnessed. Django had not only overcome his trauma, he had learned to adapt and innovate. The sofa had served as a stepping stone, providing the security he needed while he developed the confidence to embrace his natural behaviors. The sanctuary staff began to speak of the sofa protocol as a potential model for treating other severely traumatized elephant calves. They had discovered that sometimes the most effective path back to wildness wasn't through immediate immersion in natural conditions, but through a bridge of comfort that allowed healing to occur at the elephant's own pace. As summer transitioned to autumn, Django's earthbed grew more sophisticated. He learned to position it to catch the morning sun, and he began to show preferences for certain types of grasses and leaves. His weight had stabilized at a healthy 220 pounds, and his behavior assessments indicated that he was ready for the next phase of his rehabilitation. But before he could move to the larger enclosures where he would learn to interact with other elephants, there was one final step in his relationship with the sofa. The sanctuary's photographer, Maria Santos, had been documenting Django's recovery since his arrival. She proposed creating a final portrait of Django with the sofa that had saved his life. On a golden afternoon in November, with natural light streaming through the office windows, Maria captured what would become one of the sanctuary's most treasured images. Django, now strong and confident, stood beside the old leather sofa with one front foot resting gently on its arm. His trunk was extended toward the cushions in a gesture that seemed both nostalgic and appreciative. In the photograph, both the elephant and the sofa appeared to be bathed in the same warm light, creating a visual metaphor for the healing that had taken place between them. It was an image that would later be used in the sanctuary's educational materials, showing the world that sometimes the path to wildness requires an unexpected detour through compassion. The next week, Django moved to the larger rehabilitation enclosures, where he would spend the next 18 months learning to be part of an elephant herd again. The sofa remained in the office, ready to provide comfort to the next traumatized calf who might need its particular kind of healing magic. But Django carried with him the lessons he had learned during those crucial months. He had discovered that comfort and security could be found in unexpected places, that adaptation was possible even after devastating loss, and that the path home to wildness sometimes required a temporary embrace of gentleness. 6 months later, when Django was finally ready to join the semi-wild herd in the sanctuary's 1,000-acre enclosure, he displayed one final behavior that reminded everyone of his sofa days. On his first night in the larger space, instead of simply lying down wherever he felt tired, Django spent nearly an hour creating an elaborate sleeping nest from grasses, leaves, and soft earth. The keepers watching from a distance smiled as they recognized the careful, methodical movements they had first seen in the sanctuary office. Django was using the skills he had taught himself, the adaptive behaviors he had developed during his transition from sofa to earthbed. He had become not just a survivor, but an innovator. As he settled into his self-made bed under the vast African sky, with the Southern Cross shining overhead and the sounds of wild elephants calling in the distance, Django represented something profound about the resilience of life itself. Sometimes the most important healing happens not in spite of vulnerability, but because of the courage to accept comfort when it's offered. The old brown sofa had given him more than just a place to sleep. It had given him time, Time to grieve. Time to heal. Time to grow strong enough to face the wild world again. In the end, that time had been the most precious gift of all. Today, Django roams freely in the protected wilderness of the sanctuary's release site, a magnificent young bull elephant whose early trauma is visible only to those who know where to look. Sometimes, observers note, he shows an unusual preference for soft, grassy sleeping spots, and he creates more elaborate beds than other elephants his age. But these behaviors, born from his unusual journey through healing, have made him a better elephant, not a compromised one. He has learned that comfort and strength are not opposites, that adaptation is a form of intelligence, and that sometimes the path back to wildness requires a temporary embrace of unexpected kindness. The sofa still sits in the sanctuary office, its leather now cracked and worn, its cushions permanently indented from the weight of a growing elephant. New orphans have arrived and departed, each with their own story of loss and recovery. But none have needed the particular medicine that the sofa provided for Django. It remains there as a reminder that healing takes many forms, that love can be expressed through the simplest gestures, and that sometimes the most profound connections happen between species in ways that no one could have predicted. In the end, the story of Django and his beloved sofa became more than just a tale of animal rehabilitation. It became a testament to the power of patient compassion to transform even the most broken hearts. The gentle giant who once trembled alone in the African wilderness now leads younger elephants through their own journeys of recovery, teaching them by example that survival is possible, that adaptation is strength, and that sometimes the most unlikely sources of comfort can provide exactly what a wounded soul needs to heal. And in the quiet moments before dawn, when the sanctuary settles into peaceful sleep, the old sofa continues its vigil, ready to provide its particular form of healing magic to whatever small, frightened creature might need to remember what it feels like to be safe, warm, and loved.